Brockport Writers Forum presents another in its exclusive and continuing series of discussions with leading literary contemporaries. Today, the science fiction and fantasy of Gene Wolfe. Here to introduce the participants and guest is today's program host, Nancy Kress, science fiction writer from the State University of New York, College at Brockport.
With us today is Gene Wolfe, writer of both fantasy and science fiction, the winner of 2 Nebula Awards and 1 World Fantasy Award, one of the Nebulas and the World Fantasy Award for his current tetralogy, Book of the New Sun. Gene, welcome to the Brockport Writers Forum.
Thank you, Nancy.
Helping to interview Gene is Dr. Calvin Rich, faculty member at Brockport State, who teaches fantasy and romance. The first thing I wanted to ask you, Gene, is a rather serious question. Are you braced?
I'm braced.
You've stated that what makes a writer serious, whatever genre he works in, is that he has a serious view of the universe to express. What view of the universe are you trying to express in the Book of the New Sun?
I suppose fundamentally that the universe is a bigger place than we can comprehend to begin with. Chesterton said that poets were sane because they were trying to get their head into heaven, and physicists went mad because they were trying to get heaven into their head. That and the answer to the comic strip guru question of what is the purpose of life? And I think that the purpose of life is life. That is to say that life is an end rather than a means to some larger end, which is what's implied in the guru question. Of course, this is very brief. This is an abridgment, Reader's Digest answer. To really answer the question, what view of the universe is expressed in a certain book, you have to read the book. If the whole thing could be digested into a few sentences, the book would be superfluous.
There are a number of readers, and especially critics, who would say that if life is your concern, fantasy and science fiction is farther removed from it than mainstream. What leads you to write fantasy and science fiction rather than writing mainstream literature?
Because I don't agree with those people. They assume that the ephemia of today is somehow permanent and important, that we will always have yellow buses and fire plugs. Both of those are false. What is permanent and important is the creations of the human mind, of which buses and fire plugs are only very, very minor creations, and the physical world. The first of those is what we call fantasy, and the second of those is what we call science fiction, when you put it into a literary context. I don't think that reality can be defined as a knife edge in time. And of course, if you actually study physics, you discover that the time knife edge does not, in fact, exist. If you cut time finer and finer, there is no such thing as this present instant. There is only the future and the past.
You stated something similar in an article that you wrote on fantasy, in which you said that the landscape of fantasy is not the landscape of myth, but the landscape of the future.
Yes.
How did you mean that?
Well, I think it's quite obvious that the human race is increasing in its power to alter the world in the directions that it desires. To take a very obvious instance, we are now just at the beginning of the biological revolution. Cloning, the ability to combine biological material from 2 different organisms by different, I'm not trying to be redundant, I mean different species, this sort of thing. And as we increase in our ability to shape the world of our dreams in the real sense. We have the magic flying horse of the Arabian Nights. You know, we've built that sort of thing. Our jet planes give us the kind of power that those Arabian storytellers were postulating, and we're going to see more of this. We're going to see unicorns probably in this century, certainly in the first half of the next century, because a lot of people want unicorns, and unicorns are a fairly easy thing to build once the genetic engineering is there. You start with a horse and you introduce a few modifications, and you can have the unicorn of myth. You can have the fawn or the satyr of myth, and so on and so forth. I did a couple of stories on this. The woman who loved the centaur Pholus, and the woman the unicorn loved, because when people start creating these things, they're going to be around. If you create a man's head and a man's brain with a horse's hindquarters, and you figure out a way to make the thing live, and so that it can eat and keep the horse part supplied, you're not going to be able to keep it in the kitchen like a cat forever. Eventually, it's going to break free. The man centaur may very well be a better man than you are, and you're going to find that you cannot be his jailer indefinitely, and people will have to deal with these things. Of course, there are much more dangerous things that they'll have to deal with, the creation of new diseases, for example.
Do you think this is one of the reasons that some readers, like some of my students, accuse science fiction and fantasy of being so repetitive? They keep saying you have the same materials, the same themes over and over. I keep telling them to look for the variations, but nevertheless, some people...
I think that some of it is repetitive, but there are certain mechanisms that are used in science fiction because they're useful. Interplanetary travel or interstellar travel makes possible a lot of stories that wouldn't be there or that couldn't be there if you didn't have some way of getting your characters to a different planet. So they're repetitive in that sense. But I don't think that there are a great many stories around now that are specifically about interstellar travel as a thing. Some, but not a great many.
The same repetitiveness shows up in fantasy. I'm thinking now of your book as a New Sun, and the way that it uses specific traditional fantasy motifs, almost as though you were paying tribute to the genre. There is the gift of a valuable and trusted sword that recalls Excalibur, and there is the sense of a jewel of power, the claw of the conciliator, that recalls Tolkien's ring. Were these deliberate? Is this your way of paying tribute to the genre?
Yes, in some sense it is. The more intentional thing was to try to show, in the first place, how such a thing might happen, and in the second place, what the effect might really be of getting such a sword, or much more specifically, such a jewel or relic. Actually, the claw of the conciliator is a relic. Terminus est. About half the reviewers who have read the book think that Terminus est is a magic sword. It isn't. It's simply a very old and valuable sword that's very well made.
You have mentioned at various times that academic study of your work, the kind of thing that we're skirting around the edges in the Book of the New Sun here, scares you to death. Why is that?
Well, it's simply the sort of thing that we were discussing at lunch, if I'm permitted to refer to that. I think that students tend to dislike what they are made to read in class, and I would hate to see science fiction and fantasy lifted out of its position as sort of a criminal genre and given academic respectability. Because I think when it has academic respectability, a great many people are going to say it's dull. I don't want to read that. I read pulp magazines in the period when kids who read pulp magazines frequently had to do it under the covers with a flashlight because their parents wouldn't let them read pulp magazine. They, as a result, wanted very much to read the magazine.
Nevertheless, some of us are trying to approach science fiction, fantasy as an academic subject. And one of our problems is to bring continuity to what we're doing. And I was just wondering if I did use the Book of the New Sun as a text in one of my classes, what other books do you think would help in context with it, either read before or after, that would help the student understand what you were doing, or give a context, a larger context for what you were doing in the world of literature?
I hate to completely bomb out on a question, but I have a lot of trouble.
One thing I was thinking about, let's say you have floating islands in the Fairy Queen. Mm-hmm. Now, do you think it helps students to have read about the floating islands in the Fairy Queen in connection with your floating island?
I think perhaps. I think for the Fairy Queen might be a good possibility. The thing that I was thinking about specifically, frankly, was the New Testament, and I know darn well that you can't do that, and so I'm trying to find my way around it. I'm going to bomb on that question. I'm going to pass on it.
Your objection, then, to dissection of your work academically is the effect that it has on the readers, but not necessarily the effect it has on you as a writer. Do critics, reviewers, do they bother you when they dislike something that you read? Do you think there's a circle going on here of feedback from critics that then affects what the writer writes?
I think there is with some writers. I don't think that I'm particularly affected with it. When a writer is very greatly affected by critics, and particularly by academic critics, I think that he has to stop reading the criticism. I don't think that that is helpful, if you see what I mean. He begins writing to be reviewed rather than writing to be read. When I get a bad review or a critic who tears up my work, I really, really feel bad, but I only feel bad for about 45 minutes. And there are people who are wiped out for years by this sort of thing.
Why particularly academic critics? Why do you make that stricture?
Because I think that academic critics are farther from the popular taste than newspaper reviewers are to begin with. And secondly, I think that they tend to be taken much more seriously by the writers who tend to take that thing seriously. They can use stupendous words and reference the works of Joyce and God knows what. And it's all very, very impressive. But if it's destructive, you ought not to do it. It's like pounding your head against the wall.
Are you trying to give people maybe hints about how to read you by your device that you use with Thecla's book and the Book of the New Sun? There will be a text of a story from Thecla's book, and then the way Severian or someone tries to handle it, frequently without arriving at a definite conclusion.
I think so, yes.
So you're just sort of advising people how to read your work too, maybe.
Yes, and to read other work, other stories. I wanted to, in the first place, I wanted to show, as you say, that this work too could be ambiguous, particularly in the story about the autarch who sits under the tree with the wise man, and so on and so forth. About all that I can say to that is yes, you have to consider more than the superficial meaning of just about any text that's worth reading. Why should you read a one-dimensional text when you can read a multi-layered text? This is the club sandwich theory of writing, but why should you really? It doesn't cost any more. It doesn't take up any more room on the page, and it can give you something here and here and here and here, whereas the one-dimensional text only gives you here. It's a story about a space cowboy who kills a space bad man, and that's all it is.
Yet at the same time, you're castigating academic reviewers for being farther from the popular taste. And what you're just describing, the kind of multi-leveled story, is also far from the popular taste if you look at what's generally on the New York Times bestseller list, for instance. When you write, you're not specifically aiming at some conception you have of the popular taste, are you?
No, I'm trying to write the very best book that I can. I suppose I have an ideal reader in my head who's probably very much like me. But I am not writing for the people who are reading my book in order to write about it. That I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Do you think science fiction readers differ in any way from mainstream readers? Is this mythical reader that you're aiming at, even if it's only a projection of yourself, different from the average reader out there that prefers mainstream to science fiction?
Yes, I think so.
In what way?
I knew that you would ask that. I should have said no, but
Sorry.
yes, they do. They do differ. To start with, I think science fiction readers are brighter. I'm not talking, when I'm saying mainstream readers, I'm not talking about the people who are reading Shakespeare or Dante, but the people who are reading the popular bestsellers, The Bastard and so forth, John Jake's Kent Family Chronicles, etc. I think that they are much less frightened of new ideas. I think that they are eager to escape from the here and now, whereas the mainstream reader is frightened at being drawn away from the here and now, just to start with.
So much of popular mainstream literature, the romances, the Harlequin romances, though, are more escape than science fiction in that they have less connection with any real reality that's underneath.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with that. But it's a different kind of thing. It's a non-frightening escape rather than an adventure. I think the people who read science fiction and fantasy are looking for kind of an adventure. The people who read Harlequin romances are looking for a kind of paradise.
And of course the adventure can be intellectual, not merely physical.
Oh, certainly. Certainly. It should be both, ideally. It should have an intellectual component, a spiritual component, a physical component.
I'm sensing from what you say, and also from the book As a New Sun, that you don't make a sharp distinction between science fiction and fantasy.
No, I don't. I don't see really that a sharp distinction can be made. What we're talking about really publishing categories. What wire rack a book goes on to. Science fiction is always, to some degree, fantasy. If you say, I'm going to extrapolate what the science of the next 50 years will be like, that is in itself fantasy if you pretend that you think that your extrapolation is going to be 100% accurate. It never is. It may score some astounding hits, and you fade off into unicorns and elves. But unicorns, I think, are science fiction if you put them in our world rather than in the world of a medieval tapestry. And so you see, we can argue about that indefinitely. If somebody in 1800 wrote a book about a robot, a mechanical man, and there were books written that were generally clockwork, then to someone who never thought such things would exist, that was fantasy. To us looking back at the mechanical man, and we see that mobile robots can be made, and so forth and so on, and automata for Disney and whatnot, then it's science fiction. But why should the passage of 100 or 200 years make the book change its genre? It depends on the preconceptions that we bring to the book.
So that's why the Book of New Sun has so much science and magic, or seeming magic, intertwined right in the same paragraph sometimes. You're making a statement on science and magic there.
Yes. If you don't think you know how a radio works, of course most people don't know how a radio works. They only think they know how the radio works because the radio's always been there. But if you don't even think you know, then the radio becomes a magical instrument. These voices speak to you from this box. That's a fantasy device. If you're enough of a radio hobbyist that you can buy a kit at Tandy and put the thing together, Radio Shack, then it's science fiction.
You seem almost classical in the way you're concerned with the audience, though. And I didn't get that as I was reading your work. But you, for you're trying to do something to the audience, for example, and make him project, it seems, sort of the opposite of what C.S. Lewis calls egoistic castle building. And so it strikes me interesting that your main hero is a torturer, someone that the audience will find it very difficult to associate with at first and empathize with at first.
Well, I did that intentionally because I wanted to take a very unsympathetic hero so that I could show things from his standpoint. Everyone, I suppose, is a hero in his own mind. You know, the executioner who pulls the switch on the electric chair is a monster to the man who's seated in the electric chair, and sort of a hero representative of society to himself, perhaps. And I wanted to show it from a very customary, as you can see, I'm at a loss for words, something very far removed from the usual hero of fiction, who is, Commander Lance Brett of the Space Rescue Squad or something of that sort.
Well, that's one of the things that struck me first about the book. I admire an author who will take the hard job to do, and I think that's another thing you did.
I didn't find Severian unsympathetic, even from the beginning. And asking myself why not, after I'd finished the first 3 books, I didn't find a torturer unsympathetic. I think it was partly because you started out with him as a child, and we saw how his world had built the attitudes into him that he naturally would have. If you had started out with an execution in which he was presiding, I might have felt differently, but I never found him an unsympathetic character from the beginning.
Some people simply throw down the first book after the first 100 pages or so, because he is a torturer. And they can't take that. They can't deal with that, or they don't want to deal with it, perhaps, is what we should do.
Well, it does require, when you have these descriptions of the torture, it does require a certain kind of fortitude to work.
You didn't release the first manuscript for the 4 books until you had all of them done. Is that correct?
I had all of them in second draft. I did all 4 in first draft, and then I did all 4 in second draft, and then I did all the final drafts on the first book.
So you knew before the first one was published how it was going to end and how it was going to come out.
You betcha.
And you stated before that you can't write a story unless you can see the ending at the beginning.
I think it's foolish to try. I think you're trying to do your mental work on paper. A story should point toward its ending. When the ending happens, the reader should say 2 things. Should say, I didn't see that coming, but it was inevitable. I don't see how the writer can write the story that way unless he knows what's coming.
What is your working procedure when you have a story? Is there a long germination period where you're not doing your mental work on paper?
Yes, I think there is. Fundamentally, the germination period consists of the coming together of a number of ideas. I've always got a number of ideas shaking around in my head, and I'm thinking, what if such and such a character were to exist? What if these places were to exist? And sooner or later, everything clicks, or I shouldn't say everything clicks. A number of those ideas click. And I say, gee, that character there goes with this place here, and this event here, and then naturally so-and-so. And when I do that, then I see the story. I understand the fundamental outlines of the story. How it should begin, where it will go, what kind of an ending it should have. But sometimes I make false starts, certainly.
You start out then with a what if.
That's one way of phrasing it, yes.
And how do you get the what ifs, though? Is there any genesis for the kinds of what ifs you start putting together?
Is that the old where do you get your ideas question?
Yes, I think it is a Schenectady.
What I'm interested in is there a kind of exercise or something that you can go through? In my course in fantasy and romance, I have students practice their own what ifs, and some of them find it impossible to get started with them. And I just wondered if you had a little exercise.
If you want to do an exercise like that, I've done this a number of times. just brainstorm stories, encapsulating each story in a single sentence. And I can sit down with a tablet of paper and I can brainstorm more work in a half an hour than I can do in 2 years. You can say, what would happen if one of the freaks in a carnival freak show was really what he or she was presented as being. You have a mermaid, right, who is a woman with her legs deformed in a certain way and so forth. What if one freak, the mermaid, was really that thing? Would she know it? Would the others know it? How would they come to know it? What would be the result of it, and so forth.
Which story did that idea lead to?
Oh, none. I haven't written that story yet. I was just doing it for you so that you can see how it's done.
Then you just do brainstorm and then go back and pick out the most pregnant ones.
Oh, sometimes, yes, sometimes.
You mentioned exercises, and Gene, you're here with us this week partly to help with the Brockport Writers Forum summer workshops. We've had writers before who have had, and stated, a very low opinion of workshopping stories and of any kind of creative writing course. They say the only way that you can learn to write is to write. What is your opinion of creative writing courses?
Well, the only way that you can learn to write is to write. That's perfectly true. The only way that you can learn to swim is to swim, and the only way that you can learn to play the violin is to play the violin. But one of the things that students in a creative writing course do is write. And because they have some immediate feedback, hopefully from some fairly informed, concerned people, they can progress much more quickly than they would if they wrote their amateur story and sent it to a magazine and 6 weeks later got it back with a printed rejection slip. That was the way that I learned to write, and it took me about 7 years to do it. I don't think people should have to take 7 years to learn.
So the function of the creative writing class is to sharpen the critical faculty, not necessarily the creative one.
No, quite the contrary. The function is to sharpen the creative one and not the critical one. But if you listen to responses, I think your creative faculty is sharpened. And I think that's the main thing that we have to be working toward. People are saying things like, this is vague, it should be specific. The next time, if the student tries to make it specific, then he becomes more creative because he has to create something. He can't just say, 3 men walked in the door. What were these men? Why were they doing this? People say, this is dull. I want it to be more interesting. I want you to put more energy into it. This turns up creativity. If a student just studies criticism, long courses of dissecting the old masters, then what he learns is criticism, and as a creative writer, his brakes are locked, because he can see that his stuff is very, very bad, but he can't see any way to make it any better.
So given all of that, what would be your advice to young hopefuls who want to become science fiction and fantasy writers?
First of all, to read widely. I don't think that most students have read anywhere near as much as they should.
Not only science fiction?
No, widely, but with particular emphasis in the type of material that they're trying to write. Secondly, to do what you said, to write. The trouble with many talented quote-unquote writers that I have worked with is that they produce practically nothing. They have quite a bit of talent. Their work, when they do it, is good, but they produce 2 short stories a year. That doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything.
Well, I think we're fortunate that you're not producing only 2 short stories a year. Thank you for having been with us today, Gene.
Thank you.